guys ready? Yes. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for being here today. My name is Nahal Toosi. I also go by Holly, and I cover foreign policy for Politico. When I was asked to moderate this panel, I was momentarily confused as to why I'd be picked. And then I remembered, I suppose I sort of blocked this out of my mind, that I spent 3.5 years in Pakistan as a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press. And during that time, I must have written roughly 100 stories about drone strikes, often in the middle of the night, bleary-eyed, while in bed. And many of the times when I was writing those stories, I was just really left with this lingering sense of frustration about how little information we could get in what was one of the most secret programs that the US government had. So I'm really, really pleased to be here today with someone who is shedding light, actually more than one person who is shedding light on this program. Now, I did something else for the Associated Press as well, which was that I wrote book reviews. And I have to admit that I'm not the nicest book reviewer. I can be a little mean. But after having read Objective Troy, the book that brings us here today, I can, in all honesty, say it is a good book. It is a very good book. I really enjoyed it, and I'm so pleased that the author is joining us today. So let me just introduce our panelists this afternoon. The aforementioned author, Scott Shane, is an award-winning reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. Scott has covered everything from the explosion in federal contracting to the anthrax investigation to the debate over torture to, of course, the US drone campaign. His book, Objective Troy, delves into the life and death of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen killed in a 2011 drone strike in Yemen at the order of President Barack Obama. Something you may not know about Scott. He used to cover Russia for the Baltimore Sun, and he wrote a book about the collapse of the Soviet Union called Dismantling Utopia. I certainly plan to read that book, especially now that Vladimir Putin seems intent on putting the empire back together. Also joining us today is Jameel Jaffer, the executive editor of the Just Security Forum and the deputy legal director at the American Civil Liberties Union, a group which has more than a passing interest in the US drone campaign. Jameel joined the ACLU in 2002 and has litigated a number of cases related to targeted killings, as well as the National Security Agency's warrantless wiretapping program. Jameel represented the ACLU and other human rights groups in a case against the Defense Department that resulted in the release of thousands of records about the Bush administration's war on terror, including the infamous torture memos. A little-known fact about Jameel is that his undergraduate thesis was about Dante's Inferno. When I asked him what it said, he said, quote, it was some pretentious drivel. But I'm sure that it was probably brilliant. Now on to our final panelist. Jeremy Waldron is founding editor of Just Security and a professor at New York University School of Law. Jeremy has written about constitutionalism, hate speech, torture, democracy, homelessness, and many other weighty issues, including a 2010 book titled, try saying this fast, Torture, Terror, and Trade-Offs, Philosophy for the White House. Between 2009 and 2014, he was the Chichell Professor of Political Theory at All Souls College at Oxford. And an interesting fact, in 2013, Jeremy was on the winning team in a debate about drone warfare at Oxford Union. He mentioned this to me in an email with an exclamation point, so obviously he's very proud. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask a couple of rounds of questions to each panelist, and I'm going to do one question that I'd like all of them to answer, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. And if we have time at the end, I'm going to go back and we're going to have the panelists quiz one another. I was told this was ambitious, so let's just kind of play it by ear. And everyone, the one thing I do request is please ask one question at a time. And if we can come back to you, that'd be great. But I'm not a big fan of like 5-part questions. So if you guys could keep it to one, that would be great. Okay, so round one. Scott, we will start with you. Your book is very clever. It intertwines a number of stories and themes. We learn about the evolution of Anwar al-Awlaki, a US citizen of Yemeni descent, from a seemingly moderate Muslim to a fervent anti-US preacher who then forged links to al-Qaeda leaders in Yemen, where he eventually met his end. We learn about President Obama's own evolution from a strong dissident of how the Bush administration ran the so-called war on terror to a big supporter of one of its tactics, the drone strike. And we learn about the evolution of the drone program itself and what led to the extraordinary decision to target a US citizen. So tell us, what do you think are some of the unintended consequences of the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki?
Well, thanks, Holly. That's a great question. And thanks, everybody, for coming out today. I think unintended consequences are sort of a huge continuing factor in the entire campaign against terrorism, starting with 9/11. And taking the Awlaki strike in September of 2011, specifically in the sort of events that led up to it and that surrounded it, let me point to a few things. One was the president had said, go kill this guy in February of 2010. And nothing motivates all these agencies like the president getting, personally involved. And so they expended great efforts to find him. And in May of 2010, I was told that it was because they believed a particular signal of a walkie-talkie that was associated with Anwar al-Awlaki. They picked it up and they took a strike, and they ended up killing, along with a couple of al-Qaeda guys, the deputy governor of Marib province in Yemen, a hugely popular politician and a tribal leader. And, to this day, there are huge consequences in terms of, terrible relations between Marib tribesmen and the government, when there is a government. But that one was one that hugely backfired based on, I'm told, targeting Awlaki based on pure SIGINT. Another unintended consequence, and I think it's probably fair to include this, although it was after Awlaki was killed himself, was, as everybody here probably knows, was the strike 2 weeks later that killed his 16-year-old son and the son's 17-year-old cousin, along with some other guys who may have been associated with al-Qaeda. But the government has never been willing to discuss anything about that strike publicly. And in my experience in doing reporting in Yemen last year was that many Yemenis sort of understood whether they opposed or accepted the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, who had actively said that it was everybody's religious obligation to attack the United States, and they could kind of understand the logic there. The killing of the 16-year-old in particular and his cousin, really infuriated and bewildered people and left a huge resentment against the United States and U.S. counterterrorism there. I'd say the biggest unintended consequence is that if you go on YouTube today and put Awlaki's name into the search engine, the last time I checked, the number goes up and down, but it was about 62,000 videos, most of which are the entire collected works of Anwar al-Awlaki, from his 53 CD set on the life of the Prophet Muhammad recorded back in 2001, right up through, the call to jihad in March of 2010, where he, puts on a kind of army camo jacket and is wearing a traditional Yemeni dagger and tells American Muslims that it's their obligation to attack the United States. And it's had a huge impact in not just the impact that it was having when he was alive, but he's now, widely seen by his admirers as a religious martyr who speaks with greater authority from beyond the grave, so that even his innocuous early stuff, his mainstream stuff about Islamic history, now takes place in this framework of, this is the guy who America killed. And if you look at the Boston Marathon bombers, you see the impact. That, of course, happened 2 years after Awlaki was killed, but they were huge fans and got both their, some of their indoctrination and their bomb-making instructions from Awlaki on the web. Finally, I would say that a more hard to pin down sort of unintended consequence is that this was a country that, as late as July 2001, was sort of routinely condemning Israel for targeted killings of suspected terrorists. And that obviously changed in a very big way and on a large scale. But certainly anyone who in July of 2001 proposed killing an American citizen, would probably have been referred to a psychiatrist. So, whether that is an important precedent, whether there will be many circumstances in the future where some president decides that we need to kill some American citizen out there who's judged to be dangerous, is hard to say. I doubt if it'll come up that much, but it's a measure, whether you think it was a good idea or a bad idea, it's a measure of how the country has been changed by the terrorist threat. So that's a bunch of unintended consequences.
I'm sure there's many more alongside that. Jameel, as Scott has eloquently stated, Anwar al-Awlaki isn't the only American citizen to have been killed in these drone strikes, although he was, as far as we know, the only one who was intentionally targeted. His son was killed, and also a gentleman named Samir Khan was killed alongside Anwar al-Awlaki, and he was also a U.S. citizen. And I can say that I know in Pakistan in 2013, an American named Jude Keenan Mohammed died in a drone strike, and earlier this year, a U.S. hostage was mistakenly killed in a drone strike, Warren Weinstein. Now in 2013, the president announced new limits on the drone program. And recently, The Intercept published classified documents that showed that the majority of people killed in many of these drone strikes were not the intended targets, and that we're not entirely certain who they really were, though it's entirely possible they were also militants or terrorists. Do you think that the U.S. has lived up to the limits laid out by President Obama? And how can we really know if so much of the program is classified? Run with it.
Well, okay, so let me start. Actually, let me start by saying that I have to leave at 5:30. So if I step out during something Scott's saying, it's not necessarily because I disagree with him, although it may be. So let me start by just pushing back a little on this phrase "unintended consequences," which is a phrase that was used in asking the last question and the phrase that Scott responded to. I think virtually everything that Scott talked about, I'm not sure that he would disagree with this, virtually everything he talked about was completely foreseeable. It's not that, you could have easily foreseen that the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki would turn him into a martyr. It was easily foreseeable that, even foreseeable is too weak a word, it was knowable that a drone campaign on this scale would cause civilian casualties, and that those civilian casualties would generate more enemies. So I don't want to let the government off the hook with that phrase "unintended consequences," when all of this, or most of it, was entirely known or knowable even before we began on this path. As to the specific question, the short answer to your question is no. I don't think that the drone program that President Obama described in May of 2013. So I'm not sure everybody in the room knows this, but so in May of 2013, the president gave this major national security address about, among other things, the drone program, or principally about the drone program. And in that address, he set out these new limitations on the program, or at least limitations that were at least in part new on the program. But and the limitations, in my view, are actually, if you take them at face value, very, very significant limitations, and ones that bring the program, or would bring the program, much more closely in line with international law and domestic law. The problem is not so much in the standards that the president set out, but rather in the disconnect, this gaping chasm between the standards and what's actually taking place on the ground. And if you look at the strikes that took place in the months after those standards were announced, they look very much like the strikes that were taking place in the months before the standards were announced. And that may be for a number of reasons. I mean, you referred to secrecy, so you're right. It's hard to know with any certainty why that disconnect exists. But I think part of the reason is that there were some exceptions made to the application of those standards. Pakistan was carved out. According to some, the CIA was carved out, although I'm not sure that's true. But there were large holes in the standards that were announced, and the holes were announced much more quietly than the standards were announced. And then the other reason is that the standards operate at a level of generality, as standards tend to do, and they use relatively vague words like imminent and continuing and feasible words that can mean different things to different people, and words that in theory could be defined in secret documents that have not been released to the public.
So you're saying like someone has to be an imminent threat.
Right.
But then it's a question of what does imminent mean?
Right. So the phrase that the president used was continuing imminent threat. Now, start with the question how those two words can exist so in such proximity to one another. But even if you accept that there could be such a thing as a continuing imminent threat, I think to know what the president meant by that phrase, one would need to see the way that the phrase had been defined by the Office of Legal Counsel and the Justice Department and the CIA. But the memos in which those definitions are set out have been withheld from the public, and the government is working very hard to keep them from the public, even now.
Wow. Jeremy. Yeah. It'd be great if you could talk a little bit about the view from Europe, especially Britain, on the use of drones. In some ways, it seems like European states are even tougher when it comes to surveillance and other tactics and trying to root out potential jihadists in their midst. Britain has gone even so far as to strip citizenship from people that it deems threats. Can we expect to see European nations use drones more often in the future? Is this a good or a bad thing?
You can certainly expect Britain to use them more often in the future. I don't think, France will use them in circumstances of its own choosing. I'm not sure that other European countries will use them. Turkey probably in the struggle against the Kurds. The British do not seem to be squeamish about killing British citizens. You mentioned the stripping of citizenship, but the recent jihadists who were killed by British drones were British citizens, and we're told that the British government now maintains a list of all British citizens who have joined ISIS. That's not necessarily an action list or a kill list, but it's a list from which targets will be perhaps drawn for this process.
I take it it's a secret list?
Well, we don't know what the names are. We know there is such a list. Yeah. Now, here's a point. So the British don't seem to be fazed by the issue of citizenship. I want to argue, nor should we. So far as being liable under domestic law or international law to deadly force, whether somebody is a citizen of the country that's exercising this force is, I think, legally and morally irrelevant. Within the United States, whether somebody can be killed by a sniper in some security situation, whether somebody can be executed, whether somebody can be killed during armed conflict doesn't depend at all on their citizenship. The only difference it makes is if the non-citizen being executed, there's some right of consular access that may or may not be granted. And when we're operating outside the country, our citizens have no special privileges. The rights that the Constitution guarantees, it guarantees to all persons in the country, not just the US citizens, apart from the right to vote and the right to remain in the country. So we are using this American citizen aspect of the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki as a hook to get public attention. It's a hook to get public attention, but morally and politically it's not relevant. The relevant issue is not whether we are confining our killings to foreigners, but whether governments should be engaging in this business of assembling death lists and sending out death squads after them or not. The other thing to notice is a thing that many of us have long worried about with regard to targeted killing, which is that it will become not just a privilege that the United States has asserted for itself, but that defenses of it, attempts to present it as a plausible weapon in the war against terror, will be adopted by other countries as well. Here we see it being adopted by one of our strongest allies, working together with the United States in the drone program, sometimes with RAF people embedded in the American units that are engaged in this. But it was always a worry for some of us that this would come to be seen in the international community as a standard element of statecraft, a standard relationship of the state to lethal force, that as well as having regular combat operations, as well as reserving the right to use a death penalty, as well as having rights of individual self-defense and defense of others, we would have this fourth relation that states, any state, may assemble a list of its enemies, call it a death list, develop the targets, authorize the targets, action the targets, and that this would be, this would be done not only by Britain, not only by the United States, but China and Russia and South Africa and Israel, and who knows, 10 years down the line, Australia and New Zealand. I mean, is this now to be regarded as a regular piece of statecraft? Notice one other thing about the British killing of the jihadists in September and the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki in 2011. In the case of al-Awlaki, there is a tangible connection that Scott has set out in his excellent book between Awlaki and various terrorist plots, whether it's the Christmas Day bombing or various others. This was a terrorist target. I don't believe myself that that justifies targeted killing, but it's in the realm of how the program was originally set up. The ISIS jihadists are so far just jihadists, and they are challenging the viability of regimes that we have set up or that we have set up in Iraq, or that we are engaged in defending in Iraq. When David Cameron justified the killing of the British jihadists, one of the things that he said was that this was an Article 51 self-defense by Britain against attacks. Well, it's implausible, but it's at least in the right ballpark for this. But the thing that the British envoy to the United Nations said in subsequent weeks was this was Britain's contribution to the collective defense of Iraq. A killing in Syria was a contribution to the collective defense of Iraq. So you can see how the business metastasizes a little bit. From just being used as an anti-terrorist weapon, we then adapt it for the defense of regimes that we have set up, for interventions in Syria that we have set up. So we are now using it effectively to kill the active insurgent opponents of regimes that we sponsor in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And I think that should be a worry. So metastasization is happening in all these dimensions.
It's really fascinating, thank you. And I'm going to ask you guys the next round of questions, but please feel free to respond to anything you said. Scott, back in March 2011, a drone strike in Pakistan killed around 3 dozen people, many of whom, it was reported later, were innocent tribesmen gathering to mediate a dispute. Pakistan's army chief was so angry that he issued a highly unusual statement denouncing the attack. But American officials were very dismissive. And I'm going to read you a couple of quotes in the aftermath from American officials. Quote, "There's every indication that this was a group of terrorists, not a charity car wash in the Pakistani hinterlands." And quote, "These people weren't gathering for a bake sale, they were terrorists." On the ground, of course, this was one of those strikes that seemed destined to spawn more Taliban than it killed. Now, I'm not asking you to necessarily comment on this.
Those are the only two options, bake sale or terrorists.
Apparently. It might have been the same guy, like, giving the quote, but I don't know. I mean, two different sources. Now, I'm not asking you to comment on this strike specifically, but can you describe the state of the debate within the intelligence community and the national security community about whether drone strikes are doing more harm than good, now, 4 years later, and any sense of what's in the president's head now?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, partly because I think we should, it's easy to complain about and criticize these drone strikes, and Lord knows if the CIA had an armed drone up there, I might be in trouble. But but it's also, I think, important to remember the context in which these were embraced, and that was, essentially we had invaded Afghanistan and Iraq because of 9/11. God knows what the connection is to Iraq, but I think it's fair to say that we would not have invaded those countries if it were not for 9/11. Obama comes into office. I mean, obviously the technology is already in use, but Obama comes into office thinking, well, these big wars where you send 100,000 troops somewhere for 10 years don't seem to accomplish much in terms of American security. Maybe there's a better way to deal with the small numbers of terrorists who are scattered around the tribal areas of Pakistan or Yemen. And I think he's sort of a technically minded guy, and he really very much thought from the time he was campaigning and before that this was the right answer for this problem. And that is not that is not an insane thought, that if you're trying to kill 3 terrorists somewhere, that's a much better way to do it than to send a large ground force or to bomb a village. So I don't think that's, in other words, irrational. And I think that was where this program started and where it was and the reasoning that Obama had when he ramped it up in Pakistan in 2010 and moved it to Yemen. And so I would say that a phase of disillusionment, sort of we've entered that probably starting in 2011, with more focus on civilian deaths and unintentional deaths, and that's, you hear that from a significant list, probably half a dozen now, senior officials who were involved in some way or other with targeted killing when they were in government, expressing doubts about it after leaving government. And I'm thinking about, General Stanley McChrystal, or Dennis Blair, who was the director of national intelligence, or even Robert Gates, though he says he's a big fan, has expressed some concern about drone strikes. Recently, Michael Flynn, the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So a lot of these people, when they get out of office, start expressing doubts about it. And I have to believe that extends to Obama, although his aides have told me relatively recently that he still believes that drone strikes on his watch prevented, significant terrorist attacks on the U.S., and that when he discusses these things and he talks about civilian casualties, he often makes the point that you need to think about the civilians who would die, as 3,000 civilians died on 9/11, and not just those who are inadvertently killed in drone strikes. So I think he's probably, but if you watch his behavior, the strikes have come way down in Pakistan since 2010, down in Yemen since 2012 was the peak, and you've begun to see some more commando raids to catch people. And it was very interesting in those documents that The Intercept got. There was a significant amount of discussion about how we really ought to do more capture and not just killing people, in part because you can gather intelligence that way. So I think it's sort of a mixed picture, but that March 2011 strike and the defensiveness about it is kind of typical. I think the underlying problem of this program is secrecy, is exaggerated secrecy. And the fact that it's my impression that even people in the chain of the command do not immediately get the straight story on many strikes, and also that there's a lot of wishful thinking that goes on at a kind of rank and file level, where you really don't want to believe that you killed, a family of civilians, so you try to, believe that they must have been terrorists. And if you kill, 40 guys or whatever that was in a riverbed who seemed to be having a meeting, you want to believe that you didn't just kill, a bunch of tribesmen having a dispute over chromium mining, I think it was. You want to believe that they were a threat. So I think it's an evolving picture, but it's got a long way to evolve.
One of the things about that particular strike I should mention is it also happened the day after Raymond Davis left Pakistan. He was the CIA contractor who killed 2 Pakistanis that he believed were trying to get him. And there was a big, the Pakistanis wouldn't let him leave, and the U.S. tried to say he was a diplomat, and it was a mess. But it was the day after he left, and it raised a lot of eyebrows.
Can I just respond?
Absolutely, please.
So I recognize that Scott was, at least in part, making the government's argument there, not his own. But I think this is a false dichotomy between drone strikes and large-scale invasions. It's not like if we didn't have a drone campaign in Yemen or Somalia or Pakistan, we would have invaded those countries. I don't think that it's conceivable that we would have had a large-scale invasion of any of those countries. So really the choice was not between drone strikes and large-scale invasions, but drone strikes and sort of longer-term, diplomacy or law enforcement strategies. I'm not suggesting that it's always clear that those are better strategies, but I think that the idea that we were choosing between these starkly different options is not exactly right. And then I just wanted to offer another possible explanation for why the Obama administration continues to be committed to the drone program, in spite of so many officials expressing reservations about it. And even the president in his May 2013 speech wasn't entirely enthusiastic about the program. He recognized a lot of the costs of the program. So why is it that they continue to pursue this? I think that part of the explanation just has to do with the discount rate of any American administration, especially an administration at the end, in year 6. Because at some level, what the political class, if that's the right phrase, cares about is that, the next 2 years, what they're worried about is there going to be a terrorist attack on our watch? Is there going to be, is there going to be another foreign policy crisis on our watch? And so the costs that are distributed over time, the cost, the possibility that 10 years from now there'll be 10 times as many people upset or enraged at the United States as there are now, I think that's not taken into account, or at least not fully taken into account, because they know they're out of here in 2 years. I don't mean that they don't care about that, but when it comes to everyday political decisions, what really matters to them is what's going to happen today and what's going to happen tomorrow and what's going to happen between now and the time we're out of office.
Jameel, you're actually leading right into my question for you. Barack Obama is on his way out. I work for Politico. I know this to be a fact. And so what is your sense of what the next presidential administration will do with this program, Republican or Democrat, and what factors do you think they'll consider in making their decisions on how and when to use drones?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that I hope that this administration turns to soon. I don't know if you remember just before, 3 years ago when it seemed possible that Mitt Romney was going to be our president, there was a story, and Scott, you may have written it, I don't know, in which...
Afraid so.
Yeah, so the story was about anxiety in the Obama administration about the possibility that somebody else's finger would be on the trigger. And, my impression is that anxiety lasted about a week, and then they just, moved on to administering the drone program again. But somebody has to think seriously about how is this precedent going to, how is this apparatus that has been set up by this administration going to be used by the next administration, by President Cruz or President Trump or President Clinton? It's been used, I think many Americans think that it's been used on the whole responsibly. I don't think that's true. But even if you believe that, I mean, what assurance do you have that the program is going to be, that drone strikes are going to be used in the same responsible way by the next president or the president after that? I think you'd have to be crazy to believe that there are institutional checks in place right now that assure that the program won't be abused. On that point, Scott provides, I think, a fair account of this in his book. But we went to court twice to try to get judges to look both at the standards that the government was using to justify drone strikes and at the evidence that was the basis for the strike that killed Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, and the strike that killed Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, the 16-year-old son. And in both cases, the courts essentially held that the issues were not for the courts to decide, that it was really up to the executive branch and the executive branch alone to decide who was within the scope of the government's targeting authority, and whether in any individual case a person presented a sufficient threat to justify the use of lethal force. And the idea that that kind of authority is going to be in the hands of the next president and the president after that, without any oversight by the federal courts, I think should trouble anybody who believes that institutional checks and balances are useful or necessary.
Speaking of, which leads to my question for Jeremy, where the hell is Congress?
Right, good question.
I mean, what role do people's legislatures have in these sorts of decisions?
We need a public debate on this just as much as we need judicial oversight. We need both. We need a public debate on the very idea of the targeted killings. We certainly need a public debate on the parameters, on the revised definition of imminence, if that's what we have. We need the matter to find a forum. Now, we have debates like this, and there are hundreds of such debates all over the country. I took part in one in Champaign, Illinois, about 12 hours ago. So there are public debates in the informal civil society way that happens when fine books are produced and fine work is done by ACLU and other NGOs. So we're not lacking public debate in that sense, but we're lacking the sorts of debates that would center on congressional hearings. And we're lacking the sort of debate that Israel had when its high court embraced the issue as one for proper discussion in, Karine, I think it was 2006, wasn't it? Yeah. In 2006, where in a suit filed by, I think, the Committee Against Torture in Israel, but the issue wasn't torture, the issue was now targeted killing, it provided an occasion for a 3-judge panel led by President Emeritus Barak of the Supreme Court. Dorit Beinish, who's a member of this faculty, was on the court, and Justice, never mind. But it's a wonderful discussion, a powerful discussion, nuanced, complicated, deeply rooted in the appropriate set of values. It's not, the courts are not talking to anybody apart from responding to the particular advocacy that they received, and that would be the case with court hearings here. But that's one way in which a public debate can be initiated. A court decision both controls a particular set of executive decisions and initiates a public debate in response to it. But what we need above all, you're absolutely right, Hallie, what we need is congressional leadership on these matters. Not for members of Congress, as it were, to threaten to close the program down. I don't think they have authority to do that. But to at least hold hearings, which would be the orchestrated focus of public consideration on this matter. Because I repeat what I said in answering Hallie's first question, that this is a very, very considerable change. This is not just business as usual in the administration of criminal justice. This is not just business as usual in Article 51 self-defense. It's not just business as usual in regular combat operations. This is a new mode of the state's relation to lethal force. And the citizens need to have some discussion of what's being done in their name. And the opinion leaders in the community need to be able to come together. So the only real response I can give to your question is to echo it. Where's Congress? And why is there not, or why are there not a number of congressional leaders being identified as people who might, under the auspices of the Defense Committee, if not the Intelligence Committee, but some committee, lead, sponsor, facilitate a relatively formal public debate, which would then provide a further focus for the informal civil society debates that we have.
Do you guys want to weigh in on that at all? I mean, the congressional aspect.
Well, I might just remind people that the way because there was no congressional debate, public debate for years, the way it burst forth was in February, I guess it was, of 2013, when John Brennan came up for confirmation as CIA director, and that became sort of an occasion to break this subject out in the open, but it was really broken out in the open by Rand Paul's, I think it was 13-hour filibuster. And a lot of discussion was about, can you kill someone sitting in a cafe in an American city? And there was a lot of, it was not a sort of focused, debate on what we know about the program, what we should be allowed to know about the program. A lot of that still hasn't really happened. So, it sort of burst forth in that filibuster because, there hadn't been any discussion for so long.
I guess I don't have a lot of confidence that this particular Congress would have useful. I agree that there ought to be real hearings about the drone program. I'm not sure that it's realistic to think this Congress will hold those hearings. And some of the congressional leaders who one would hope would take the lead are highly invested in the drone program. Right. But I want to just expand on something else that Jeremy said earlier, which is about the way that secrecy has distorted this debate. I think part of the reason that Congress hasn't focused more on this, even the people in Congress who you might expect to ask questions about a program like this, part of the reason they haven't is that there's so little information in the public domain about the drone campaign that there's not a lot of pressure brought to bear on those members of Congress to ask questions. And I think that the secrecy has distorted the public debate, and the secrecy has been distancing. And in a way, people are always complaining that, or observing that, drone strikes deliver remote violence, right? We're distanced from the violence, and that's obviously true. that there's a further distancing because of the secrecy. We don't even see the results of the, of the violence. It's very rare that the results of individual drone strikes are covered with anything more than a blurb, on page A17 or something like that. It happens, right? Yeah. But it's not that common. And I think that's part of the reason that there hasn't been more debate in Washington.
Thank you, all of you. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the floor. So please, yes, let's start here.
Turn the microphone
Yeah,
off,
just hit speak.
And
please introduce yourself.
Oh, my name's Suzanne Klebe, and on this question of a congressional debate, it would seem that the most obvious thing, if the President of the United States says he has the right, he and John Brennan, to murder people, including American citizens, and this overrides the constitutional protection, that the congressional debate should be impeachment. And that is a grand jury type format to go through whether or not these actually are crimes against the Constitution. And I think that the American population is horrified in many ways by these wars and the explosion of terrorism and the fact that the U.S. is doing these things without congressional authorization. But the idea is, what is the consequences? And just a discussion doesn't actually do it. You actually have to remove people who are involved in infringing on the Constitution. I work with the Executive Intelligence Review, and we're having Lyndon LaRouche, who's the editor of it, has also said, look, you're dealing with somebody who has a pathological commitment to murder. He enjoys this. It's a real problem. He's been quoted talking to his aides about finding out he's very good at killing.
What's the specific question?
Well, my specific question is, if we have a president whose own background, his stepfather was involved in the massacre in Indonesia, and he says he enjoys killing, and he says he can do it without any legality involved, simply because he's in a war against terror. Don't you think impeachment is we're in a law school. What are the legal consequences of this? And secondly,
to be fair, I would say that since I was one of the reporters who reported what Obama said, I should put that in context. What he's reported to have said by aides, to have said to various aides on several occasions, with chagrin, actually, not with pleasure, is it turns out I'm very good at killing. And I think that was I think that was in the context of, I wanted to close Guantanamo, and I got completely tied up in knots, and I've made some progress, but not much. But if I tell them go kill Anwar al-Awlaki, it happens. I don't think it was an expression of pleasure, and I think we're so far from having the knowledge of this program that you would need to impeach a president. We need a basic level of public information about these strikes to be, sort of routine, I would say.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to endorse that last point. The debate is about the legality at the moment, and it is a genuine, open, difficult debate. The debate is about constitutionality, and it's a genuine, open, difficult debate. It's not just that we don't have the information. There is a serious debate to be had, and that's miles before you come close to impeachment. I think these are matters of public concern. I think they are matters of constitutional moment. I think the American citizen business is a nonsense and a distraction. But to think that impeachment is our way into public debate on this issue is a mistake.
Jameel, did you want to?
I just want to say this. You had also said that the change in the country was the cultural change under the pressure of the
Maybe
war.
you should give somebody else a turn.
I will, but I just think it's so urgent that, the culture hasn't changed because of the war on terror. The culture has changed because of the allowing of Bush, Cheney, and now Obama to rip up the Constitution and put the U.S. in the position of running illegal wars and murders internationally. That's what's changing the culture.
Thank you. We're going to take maybe a couple of questions at a time and have them answer. Your question first?
Thanks. So when we talk about the drone program, we talk about sort of like one program, right? But we have the military and the CIA both doing strikes and different types of strikes, strikes on specific people, sort of signature strikes on groups of people. I'm wondering, Scott, what you've sort of learned about the differences between those two entities and how they conduct strikes. Are there more hurdles for the CIA or less? Is one sort of entity more effective than the other?
Let's try to get one more question in, and then go ahead. Yes, back there.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion. I have a question. I'm wondering how we can understand the fact that the American courts refuse to judge or to emit decision on targeted killings when in Israel, for instance, the Supreme Court see itself as competent to do a judgment. And I was also wondering how we can avoid this idea of legal washing, because, for instance, in Israel, you have the claim that because of the Supreme Court decision on targeted killing, no targeted killing is legitimate, and in the end, they didn't really impose any real constraints on the policy. And I'm thinking of the committee that are supposed to assess the legality of the strikes that are secret, and so we don't know any compensation or anything. So, thank you.
Well, on the first question, the two entities that are known to carry out drone strikes, are the CIA, which operates in Pakistan and Yemen, and JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, a secretive branch of the military that operates in Yemen and has operated some in Somalia as well. This is one of the things that is kind of confusing about, I think lines of authority are confused, rules are confused, because there is a separate process that the CIA goes through before it decides on a strike from the sort of sequence of judgments and decisions that JSOC does when it takes a strike. I think in general, there was at the same time that Obama gave the big speech in May of 2013, administration officials were saying they wanted to transfer this from, the CIA to JSOC because it was a military function, and then they could be more transparent, although JSOC has been anything but transparent about its strikes. And part of that was just premised on the idea that, the CIA ought to be an intelligence agency and not a military agency. But in fact, as far as anyone can tell, very little progress towards that supposed goal has actually been made. So you still have these two parallel agencies. One thing that I heard was, I know that the congressional intelligence agencies kind of rallied around the CIA's drone program and spoke out strongly, privately to the executive branch, saying, we don't want the CIA to lose its drone program. So it's sort of quite a tangle now, and you can hear differing opinions on which of those agencies does a better job. Most of the groups that track strikes say they're both doing a better job than they were some years ago. The number of civilian casualties appears to have declined over the years that they've been taking these shots. And some people say that the intelligence is better in Pakistan than in Yemen because we've kind of had intelligence operations there for a longer period of time. But that's, a lot of that is sort of in a black box and hard to judge for sure.
And the second question on
Yeah, just to quickly respond to the question about the Israeli Supreme Court. The first explanation is that the rules of standing are massively more relaxed for the Israeli High Court than they are for the US federal courts. I remember hearing Dorit Banish saying, you denied standing to a man to question the potential killing of his son? What were you thinking? But the fact is we have these very restrictive rules of standing. That's not written in stone, but there they are. And evidently, there's a greater unwillingness to defer to this being a purely military or security matter and not within the purview of the courts. You make a very good point in your second point, that merely having a good hearing on this, a hearing in which the possibility of targeted killings, not usually drone killings, but targeted killings by squads of men, were permissible under certain circumstances, doesn't guarantee that policy will be administered. But the court gave great emphasis to the issue of the or capture part of kill or capture. And I'm sure that has been brought into the considerations of the panels, the secret panels, legal panels, lawyers panels, that consider each killing by the IDF, but the situation is by no means satisfactory. A court can initiate a public debate. It doesn't necessarily consummate the public debate.
Yeah, just once again to expand on something that Jeremy was saying, the courts here have been very deferential to the executive branch on national security issues generally since 9/11, even before 9/11, but especially since 9/11. And on secrecy, that's been especially true. Whenever the government says that something can't be disclosed, the courts tend to defer to that assertion. That has been profoundly frustrating to those of us who've been litigating these cases, in part because we're using this word secrecy as a kind of shorthand, but it's not really secrecy, right? It's not that we don't know anything about the program or the government doesn't say anything about the program. The things that we know about the program don't count in court. And the government, because the government hasn't officially acknowledged them, and there's a whole set of doctrines here in the United States that relate to official acknowledgement, so the frustration is the things that we know don't count in court, and then on top of that, the government declares that certain things have to be secret, but it doesn't preclude government officials from speaking about those things on a near daily basis, right? So we've had a series of senior government officials give speeches about the legal reasoning underlying the drone program. You can read in the newspapers every day, literally every day, some unnamed government official talking about some strike somewhere in the world, Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia, and assuring the public that the strike was lawful and that no civilians were killed. I mean, that's routine, right? But when we get into court, the government it's only in court that we can't talk about those things, right? So it's not really secrecy. Maybe secrecy is a piece of it, but the bigger issue is not secrecy but selective disclosure. That the government is allowed to disclose what it wants to or say what it wants to about the drone program, with no accountability in court for those statements. And we're doing the ACLU, and there are other organizations that are involved too. The Center for Constitutional Rights we're doing what we can to push back against that kind of deference to government assertions of secrecy. But I have to say we have not been nearly as successful as we would have liked to be. There are a set of cases now in the Second Circuit and the DC Circuit that involve the extent to which the government can withhold information that in some sense it's already released. And it's perverse that we would have to have this argument, right, about whether we're entitled to information we already know. But that is sort of a sign of the times, or an indication of how far how far off course the debate has gone.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second. We don't have a member of the U.S. government on this panel, which is kind of frustrating to me as somebody who tries to get balance and nuance. It's part of my job. But what is so terrible about keeping a lot of this stuff secret? I mean, let's think about this. I mean, this is the information age. Hackers are going crazy. And I mean, I remember there were stories where on a couple of occasions the U.S. tipped off the Pakistanis that they were going to do a drone strike, and the Pakistanis tipped off the militants, and the militants got away. I mean,
But nobody's asking the government to disclose the targets of its next drone strike. That's not what the debate is about, right? The debate is about, are we entitled to know what the law is? Under what circumstances can the government kill people? That's what we want to know. Or, you killed Anwar al-Awlaki in 2011. Why did you do it? That's what we want to know. The same kind of information that the government would have to present if it charged somebody with a crime. Right? So there's something bizarre about the fact that if you charge somebody with a crime, with a terrorism-related crime, you have to present your evidence to a jury.
You speak to this like this is so logical. Why don't they just
I think
agree
it is logical,
with me?
Right.
But my question then is, well, why don't they agree with you? If you were to argue their case, what would you say?
Well, I mean, I can tell you what they say in court. The argument that the government makes is essentially that the legal analysis is intertwined with sources and methods. We can't tell you what the law is, but because if we told you what the law is, you would also learn certain facts, and those facts are useful to foreign terrorist organizations. But it seems to me that this is a compromise, if it is a compromise. It's a compromise that is inherent to democracy, right? The public has to know what the law is. If the public doesn't know under what circumstances the government is carrying out killings in its name, then at a certain point you have to start questioning whether the policy has democratic legitimacy.
Questions? Yes, gentleman right there.
Hi, I'm a student here at NYU. My name is Amandeep Singh. The response of civil society in a lot of this conversation seems to circle around the need for transparency, but falling short sometimes of calls for formal accountability of individuals who have been involved in this program. Obviously there are legal issues regarding whether somebody relied on the existing law and so forth. But why is it that the calls for formal legal accountability have been markedly short compared to the Bush administration? Do you all think that there has been any impact by the fact that this is a Democratic administration and much of the civil society is in a way institutionally invested, with their guy? And while recent cases have been mentioned that have aggressively pushed back, they are quite recent. There was a long time where a lot of policies from the Obama administration that had questionable legality were not being pushed up against. So I'm just curious if you could comment on why the calls for accountability are falling so short, and what impact the political party of this president
That's an
has.
interesting question.
I'll try. In part, it's the same response that we gave to Suzanne, which is that you can't begin talking concretely about accountability until you establish what the legal situation is. And at the moment, we need to have a debate about what the institutional and legal arrangements are that are actually in place. And then we can examine that, relate that to our knowledge of the Constitution and our knowledge of the law, and figure out whether any crimes have been committed. Same as we did with the torture cases. I mean, admittedly, there's an embarrassing lack of accountability there as well, but there was certainly some political accountability.
Yeah, I also wonder well, so first, just in the defense of American civil society, we, at least at the ACLU, and this is true of a number of our partner organizations as well, we started asking questions about the drone program in 2009, and we actually wrote a letter to the administration in April of 2009 stating that the drone program, as we understood it, was unlawful and unconstitutional. And we sued in 2010, alleging that the then contemplated killing of Anwar al-Awlaki would be unconstitutional. So I feel like we've been raising a ruckus about this from the beginning. Whether anyone's been listening to us is a different question. But sort of to go to both of the questions that were asked about individual accountability. I wonder if in a way that's that the focus on individual accountability might be distracting in this context, because the problem here isn't it's not a problem of rogue actors at the top of the government. I wish it were, because then the next administration could be relied on to do something different, right? Then we could just say this is an aberration, and we'll go back to our Constitution when this administration is out of office. The problem is actually just the opposite. The problem is that we now have this entrenched infrastructure that allows whoever is at the head of the government to kill people, both citizens and non-citizens, on the basis of vague and largely secret legal standards, and on the basis of evidence that is never presented to the public and never presented to a court. And that, to focus on individual accountability is to sort of lose sight of that much bigger problem. The institutional problem, I think, is a much bigger one than would be suggested by a focus on Obama or Brennan. Not to say they haven't made decisions that I think are indefensible, but to say to pretend that it's a Brennan problem, I think is to miss the larger the larger problem.
Yes.
So my question is about, I'm John Nahal, I'm an independent journalist. My question is about Anwar al-Awlaki, and one thing that Obama has said about the killing of al-Awlaki is that he wasn't killed because he was a propagandist, he was killed because he was operational. And Scott, I'm curious to hear you talk about what the public record and what your reporting sort of says on that, whether the moment when he goes from being a propagandist to being operational, and then Jameel, if you feel like the public record on that distinction is also as clear as Obama has sort of said it is?
That's a good question. Yeah, everybody accepted that Anwar al-Awlaki was a sort of propagandist for al-Qaeda, but as I understand it, the Obama administration did not think he was targetable based on those activities, and it was only when he was judged to be an operational terrorist actually participating in lethal plots that he was targetable. And so the evidence, as with everything else, the evidence is mostly secret. But I do think that, Obama reportedly said to aides about his judgment on the kill order for al-Awlaki that this is an easy one. And I think what he was referring to is that there was a surprising amount of evidence relative to other cases of targeted killing, because you had Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the young Nigerian who tried to blow up the plane over Detroit, who told the FBI that Anwar al-Awlaki had sort of vetted him and coached him and participated in sending him over to blow up this plane, and specifically had instructed him to wait until he was over U.S. soil before he detonated the bomb. Now, I say that despite the fact that I have been trying for 2 years, more than 2 years, to get the FBI interviews with Abdul Muttalib. And now we sued, and the New York Times sued on my behalf, and we're fighting in court over it now, and we still don't have them. But there is enough evidence, and I've talked to enough people who've seen them and who know the contents of what he said, that I believe he really did say that. And there's some other circumstantial evidence. There was the plot with the bombs in printer cartridges put aboard cargo planes addressed to Chicago. There's a lot of reason to believe, although he never took public credit for it, to my knowledge, that al-Awlaki had a role in that plot as well. And agencies claim, on background, that he did have a role, that they have other intelligence information. But there's information based on an article in Inspire magazine, the Al-Qaeda magazine, and other stuff that suggests that he had that role. So I actually think that, and then you combine that with, unlike most of the people that we've killed in drone strikes, Anwar al-Awlaki, was on the internet every chance he could get, saying that it was not only his religious obligation, but the religious obligation of every Muslim to attack the United States. And so, it wouldn't be surprising if he followed his own advice on that count. So I think it's a fairly strong, given the secrecy, I think it's a fairly strong case.
Yes.
Hi, Chris Terrace, 2L here. Professor Waldron, you've talked on a number of occasions about the distinction between citizen and non-citizen. Well, actually, how it's a useless distinction. I'm wondering about a different distinction, which we've kind of glossed over a bit, between drone killing and targeted killing more generally. If, as you say, Jameel, the real underlying issue is that the legal standard under which the administration is killing people is secret, if that's the real issue, then what is the difference between the two? And why is it more legitimate in the public eye for SEAL Team 6, for instance, to go in and assassinate somebody in a drone strike?
And by the way, why don't we use the word assassinate more in this concept?
Because it's partly a term of art, and you can get caught up in terrible debates about executive order number.
The administration gets very upset when you use that word.
That's right. They also get very upset when we use words like death list.
I think there's more to it than that. I mean, traditionally, assassination is the killing of a prominent political figure. So Anwar al-Awlaki might qualify, although it's usually a political leader. But most of the people who've been killed in drone strikes would, by no stretch of the imagination, have traditionally been considered assassination. Right. But the other thing is that there is a ban on assassination that every administration has, endorsed and re-upped, and so they do not believe this is assassination. So I think it can kind of muddy the waters to call all of these killings assassinations.
Yeah. On the point about drones and targeted killings more generally, of course, the category is targeted killings. It doesn't particularly matter what technology is used. There are some interesting side issues about chivalry and reciprocity and the remoteness of warfare that if time permitted, one would have a great disquisition on. But the fact is these are intentional killings, sometimes by squads on the ground, sometimes by drones in the air. The Osama bin Laden killing, it seems to me, secured whatever legitimacy it had in the public mind, not from the fact that it wasn't done by a drone, but from the fact that it was Osama bin Laden. That doesn't make it right. There are still issues about what the precise justification was. And as many people would say, around that time in Afghanistan, and certainly in Afghanistan, maybe into Pakistan as well, people were being sent out on kill or capture missions on a regular daily basis. So this was but one of the non-drone targeted killings. In Israel, as I said, the debate has been about targeted killings per se without any particular emphasis on drones. And as I think both my friends on this panel, and Hallie too, have emphasized, eventually we have to talk about killing. We have to talk about the maintenance of kill lists, or the maintenance of death lists, as I call them. And we have to talk about the use of death squads, whether they're actually squads going out for face-to-face killing or whether it's more distant forms of killing. And that's the issue that we have to talk about, the institutionalization of this, what it reveals about us as a country to the world, that we maintain a list of our enemies to be eliminated in this way. So I take the point entirely that targeted killing is the proper category we should be talking about.
There is this amazing interview. It was published in Newsweek, I think in 2012. Tara McKelvey is the reporter, and she interviewed John Rizzo, who had recently retired as the acting director, acting general counsel of the CIA. And they're talking about the targeted killing program, and he's speaking very freely, more freely than I think he now wishes he had spoken, but very freely about the program, and he describes his own role in the program. He describes how they select targets. And McKelvey says something at one point about, so you could use these drones in this country or that country or that country. And Rizzo says, well, why do you say drones? You know, it could as easily be a bullet to the back of your head. And that's the former acting general counsel of the CIA. And I mean, I think he's right. And once you accept these legal standards, there's no reason why the delivery mechanism has to be a drone. And it makes you think, I think, a little bit differently about things like the Russians killing of Litvinenko in London in, when was that, 2000?
With
I don't know,
polonium?
6 with polonium. They poisoned his sushi, I think, right? So, but there's no reason why once you accept this authority, the authority has to be exercised by the use of drones. There are many other ways you can kill people.
It was
Could I just add-
alleged Russian killing. But
Alleged Russian killing.
But go ahead.
Could I add just one? I do think that the drone makes a difference in one sense, and it's quite vividly illustrated by the Aleki case, and that is that the president had to decide, based on advice, whether he was going to order these agencies to try to capture Aleki or to kill him. If you imagine a capture order, let's say he said, this guy's an American citizen, and despite what Jeremy says, I'm an American, and I'm the American president, and I want to give him an extra, special treatment, and so we're not going to kill him. We're going to send SEAL Team 6 to get him. It's an extremely dangerous situation. It's easily imaginable that a couple of SEALs get killed, and Aleki gets killed. I mean, these are guys who would have fought to the death. So imagine what Congress has to say when it opens the hearing, a week later. The President of the United States, despite knowing that there was a technology, a proven technology, for killing this guy with absolutely no risk to U.S. personnel, ignored that and sent these brave men to be killed in Yemen. It makes it very difficult to make that choice, much more difficult than it was prior, I think, to the technology of the drone. So, as I think Jameel mentioned, one of the criteria in the legal opinion justifying or authorizing the killing of Aleki was that that capture be infeasible, and they leave it up to CIA to sort of say, yeah, we think it's infeasible. But that's obviously a very fuzzy term. What's feasible, what's infeasible under certain circumstances, at what risk? But I think drones have changed the calculation in that sense.
Right. And you can't capture somebody with a drone.
Not so far.
Well, yeah, but what I read today apparently was that Walmart is thinking about using drones to deliver things now, and Amazon will be as well. So I definitely imagine a day where we're going to all be wondering if pieces of drones are going to be falling on us when they collide in midair. Since we have only 10 minutes until Jameel turns into a pumpkin and we have to close this, I wanted to know if you guys had any questions you wanted to ask each other, any challenges to one another.
I have a question for Scott, which is, you spent a lot of time writing this book, obviously. I think it's, I think it's a very good book, but I'm wondering what questions you think are still open. Like, which questions were you not able to answer that you feel, really, are you frustrated that there are certain really important questions that you weren't able to answer?
Well, I mean, as I said, I'm still fighting in court to get the Abdul-Muttalib interview summaries, which is the core of the case on which the U.S. government decided to kill Anwar al-Awlaki. I believe that they will probably say what prosecutors said in court at Abdul-Muttalib's trial, which was sort of cut off because he pleaded guilty very near the beginning of the trial. But I would really like to get those documents to see what the evidence is and what the quality of the evidence is that was used. That was sort of the core of the reason that they decided to kill this guy. That's certainly one thing. There is a bit of a lingering mystery, and I take one side of it, as to whether Anwar al-Awlaki, who had been first investigated by the FBI on terrorism grounds in '99 into 2000, and then subsequently followed all over Washington in 2001 and 2002. He had two of the hijackers in his mosque at San Diego. He had two other hijackers who showed up in his mosque or one of those from San Diego and another one who showed up in his mosque in Virginia. So there's still this cloud of suspicion. Personally, I think it's probably a red herring, and that he probably had no connections to Al-Qaeda of any significance before, many years after that. But I guess I would love to get to the bottom of that one too.
I have a question for Jameel because for Jameel, but it concerns the ACLU part of your work. ACLU has done wonderful and honorable and thankless work on this issue.
I think there's a but coming. Yeah.
No, it's not really, but can you tell us a little bit about why it is particularly a civil liberties issue? Mm-hmm. I can see a sort of a very general account, which is ACLU stands for the proposition that we love our government, but we have to watch our government. And each new power it has is a power that is liable to be abused, and we have no experience to the contrary in the whole of human history. And we want to be very, very careful about these powers. But it seems a slight departure from the regular remit, which is civil liberties in the United States. This is not in any way a reproach or an accusation, but I'm just interested to see exactly how you define your position.
Yeah, obviously civil liberties is in our name. I think that the mandate, at least since 9/11, has been understood more broadly to encompass international human rights more broadly, more generally, at least with respect to the U.S. government's activities abroad. We were very involved in criticizing the use of torture in CIA facilities overseas. This is connected to something that you were talking about earlier, which is, why has the debate focused so much on the fact that Anwar al-Awlaki is a U.S. citizen, right? And this has been, this has been frustrating for us too. But the tools we have available to us in U.S. courts are limited, right? And it's hard enough to get a court to engage with the argument that a U.S. citizen's constitutional rights are being violated. But the idea of getting a U.S. court to engage with an argument that Yemeni citizens' rights under international law have been violated. Similar cases have been attempted in the torture context and have failed. Right. And so, by necessity, we focused on the case that we thought we could actually bring. I think that bringing that case did spark a public debate, and I'm glad that it did. But I am also, I think all of us who worked on that case know that the case also distorted the public debate in precisely the way that you alluded to earlier. It focused the debate around the killing of U.S. citizens. And while I do think there's an argument that politically there's something different about a government killing its own citizens, I think that the biggest question here is not a political or a legal question, it's a moral question, and the moral debate has been displaced by this much narrower legal debate. I just don't know, knowing everything I know now, I think we still would have brought the case, but it is a frustration for us.
Sure, I understand.
Scott, do you have any questions for your co-panelists?
Actually, I was going to ask the one about citizenship. Let me just ask Jeremy, it was very interesting to me to hear the point you made about citizenship. To what degree is your point accepted across the legal academy? In other words, are there those who actually make a strong distinction between U.S. citizens and non-citizens?
There are certainly people who claim that there is such a distinction in constitutional law. And people like my former colleague at Columbia, Jerry Newman, has written a book called Strangers to the Constitution, which is about the situation of non-U.S. citizens in relation to the Constitution when they are, like me, here. And we have this further category of U.S. persons under the Patriot Act, which includes you and includes me.
And companies.
And companies, that's right. So there are certainly debates about the peripheral application of the safeguards in the U.S. Constitution, their peripheral application to non-citizens. I know of nobody who has articulated an argument that the rules about killing people are relaxed in the case of non-citizens. They're relaxed in the case of combat, and that would, in a civil war, you'll be engaged in combat against citizens. They're relaxed in the case of self-defense, but you can defend yourself against a citizen or a non-citizen. They're relaxed in the case of executions, but we execute non-citizens and we execute citizens as well, and there's no important legal difference there.
Do you think that there's a difference in terms of the process? That you think that would be defensible? That U.S. citizens, that citizens of that country are entitled to a different process, to judicial review, or you think even that would be indefensible?
Is the Fifth Amendment not relevant at all?
I think all of these amendments, the due process guarantees of the Fifth Amendment and other due process guarantees, my understanding is that those apply indiscriminately to any person the government is dealing with, certainly within the country. The usual understanding is that they don't apply at all to our dealings with anybody outside the country. And certainly in a combat situation, they have just no application at all. So there may be disagreement about the edges, around the edges, but my understanding has always been the main constitutional differences between citizens and non-citizens have to do with voting. They don't have to do with access to the courts. They don't have to do with due process. They don't have to do with the security of life, and they don't have to do with Eighth Amendment protections.
I wish Donald Trump was here so I could ask his opinion.
He would have the
Before we wrap up, I just want to thank everyone for coming today. You can probably get them afterward. But I also want to mention that we have some copies of Scott's book out here available for sale, so please buy it. It's an excellent book. And thank you guys so much for coming today. Thank you.
Real pleasure to work with you.
That was fun.
Wonderful. It is. I would have brought my copy to get signed, but I've been on the road.
And I should have probably talked more about the citizenship thing in there, because it really is. He's sort of the canary in the coal mine.
He's a canary in the coal mine. It's exactly right. And I didn't want to dispute the fact that it was a useful place.
Yeah, but it was. Actually, I was a little fuzzy on that, so that was very cool.
Right.
Hey.
Hey, Mark.